Let me tell you something that most people don't truly understand until it's far too late. Even though the math has always been right in front of them, every hour you trade for money disappears the moment you stop working. It does not compound, it does not multiply, and it does not create freedom. It simply ends. And that single fact explains why millions of hard-working Americans earning decent incomes through salaries, bonuses, overtime, and side hustles still feel permanently behind despite doing everything right. Because they are stuck in a linear equation where income equals hours times rate, and the only levers available are working longer weeks or negotiating a higher hourly value, both of which eventually hit ceilings imposed by time, energy, health, taxes, and aging, especially once real-life constraints like Medicare eligibility, Social Security timing, rising healthcare costs, inflation, property taxes, and HOA fees start compressing cash flow later in life. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people never confront: linear income feels safe, predictable, and respectable, but it is fundamentally fragile, because if you stop, it stops. Which is why the real financial shift doesn't come from asking, "How do I make more money this year?" but from asking a better question that reframes the entire game. How do I build assets that keep working whether I'm awake or asleep? Because once you start optimizing for compounding instead of paychecks, everything changes. Your decisions slow down, your patience increases, and your focus shifts from immediate gratification to long-term systems that grow independently of your daily effort. And this is not about quitting your job, glorifying hustle culture, or pretending entrepreneurship magically solves everything, because most businesses fail and many business owners are just self-employed workers with more stress and longer hours, which means they've escaped employment but not the time for money trap. So the real distinction isn't employee versus entrepreneur, it's time renter versus asset owner. And here's where the math becomes unavoidable. Linear growth adds, compounding growth multiplies, and given enough time, multiplication always wins, not as an opinion, but as arithmetic. So let me ground this in something practical for a U.S. audience. Because compounding isn't some abstract billionaire concept, it already exists inside tools many Americans have access to but underutilize, like 401ks with employer matches, Roth IRAs where qualified withdrawals can be tax-free, taxable brokerage accounts invested in diversified index funds, rental real estate that can generate net cash flow and long-term appreciation, or even small scalable systems built around skills that don't require proportional time input. And if you're thinking, this sounds good but feels distant, ask yourself this simple engagement question. If your income stopped tomorrow, how long would your current assets continue paying you? A week, a month, or years? Because that answer tells you whether you own assets or just rent time. And here's a simple math example that most people intellectually understand but emotionally ignore. If someone invests a $10 into a diversified portfolio earning an average 7% annually, not guaranteed, just historical context, after 30 years that single decision grows to roughly $76 without adding another dollar. But if that same person interrupts the process every few years by cashing out, chasing the next shiny opportunity, or consuming the gains, the exponential curve never has time to form. And that's why patience, not brilliance, is the real advantage. Which leads to a short case example that plays out constantly in real life. Imagine two people earning $100,000 a year, both smart, both disciplined, but one maximizes lifestyle and upgrades every raise, while the other quietly maxes a 401k, funds a Roth IRA, invests consistently in low-cost index funds, avoids high-interest debt, and reinvests returns instead of spending them. And 20 years later, the income histories may look similar, but the balance sheets are worlds apart, because one person built compounding systems, while the other optimized consumption. And this is where psychology sabotages otherwise rational adults, because humans are wired to prioritize immediate rewards, social proof, and perceived safety. So trading time for money feels good because the feedback loop is short. Work today, get paid Friday. While building compounding assets feels uncomfortable because the rewards are delayed, invisible, and boring, which is exactly why they work. And if you're wondering, isn't this risky? The real risk is not volatility, it's dependency. Because a single income stream tied entirely to your labor is fragile in a world of layoffs, health shocks, automation, and rising costs. especially once you factor in that Social Security was never designed to replace full income. Medicare doesn't cover everything, and inflation quietly erodes purchasing power year after year. So the rational approach isn't reckless bets. It's starting small, staying within your circle of competence, protecting downside risk, and building compounding systems while you still have earned income to support yourself. And let me pause here for a second engagement question. Are your current financial decisions designed to make this year comfortable or the next 30 years resilient? Because those are very different goals. And this is where many people get stuck on the wrong objection, saying they don't have enough capital. When capital is not just cash, it's skills, knowledge, networks, and time that can be converted into scalable systems, whether that's automated investing, digital products, rental properties, or businesses that don't require your constant presence. And no, this is not a get-rich-quick promise, because there are none here. There are only trade-offs. And the trade-off for compounding is patience, especially in the early years when nothing seems to be happening, when peers appear to be out earning you, upgrading homes, taking vacations, and posting wins on social media, while you're reinvesting quietly and wondering if you're behind. And that is exactly the psychological danger zone where most people interrupt the process, reset the clock to zero, and never experience the exponential phase, which is why discipline matters more than intelligence, and why saying no becomes a financial superpower. No to unnecessary consumption, no to investments you don't understand, no to opportunities that consume time without compounding, because every dollar reinvested is a dollar that can multiply. And every hour spent building systems is an hour that can pay you back repeatedly. And here's the part that often surprises people. Once compounding finally takes hold, the goal isn't just more money, it's control over your time, your schedule, your attention, and your priorities. Because when assets start covering expenses, even partially, you negotiate life differently. You choose work instead of needing it. You say no to bad deals. You optimize for meaning instead of urgency, and that is the real dividend of compounding. And if you're thinking this sounds abstract, bring it back to something concrete and familiar, like retirement planning, because the difference between someone who starts investing at 25 versus 35 is not 10 years of contributions, it's decades of compounding, which is why delaying action is far more expensive than making small mistakes early. And this leads to the simplest mental model you can carry forward. Every financial decision either compounds or consumes. Contributions to a 401k, Roth IRA, diversified portfolio compound. High interest consumer debt consumes. Lifestyle inflation consumes. Reinvested cash flow compounds. And the question to ask isn't, how much does this pay today? But does this grow without requiring more of my time? And once you start asking that question consistently, your behavior changes automatically, because you stop chasing excitement and start respecting boring systems that work. And here's your final engagement question to sit with. If you tracked your last week honestly, how many hours went toward building compounding assets versus just maintaining income and consumption? Because even 5 focused hours a week, sustained over a decade, can create outcomes that look impossible from the outside. And that's not hype, it's math. And before we wrap this up, here's the required reality check and disclaimer stated clearly: this content is for educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. Investing involves risk, including loss of principal. Returns are never guaranteed, and tax outcomes vary based on individual circumstances. So decisions about investing, retirement accounts, and asset allocation should consider your personal situation, but the principle remains universal and timeless. Compounding rewards patience and punishes delay, so the choice in front of you is simple but not easy. Continue trading your non-renewable time entirely for money, or begin redirecting a portion of that time and income into assets that can work without you. And every year you wait doesn't just cost you progress, it costs you the exponential growth of all the years that follow. So start small, stay consistent, protect the process, and let time do what it does best. And if this framework changed how you think about money even slightly, subscribe to the channel for more US-focused personal finance breakdowns on investing, retirement taxes, and long-term wealth building. Drop a comment with the word COMPOUND if you want a follow-up video on specific asset types beginners can start with. And when you're done here, watch the next video where we break down how average Americans can realistically use 401ks, Roth IRAs, and index funds to build compounding wealth without chasing risky shortcuts. Let me share a truth that takes most people decades to fully absorb, even though the mathematics have always been obvious. And that truth is this: every hour you trade directly for money dies the moment you stop working. It does not compound, it does not multiply, and it does not create freedom. It simply ends. And this single reality explains why so many hardworking Americans who are intelligent, disciplined, and well-paid still feel financially stuck despite earning more than their parents ever did, because they are operating inside a fundamentally limited equation where income equals hours multiplied by rate, and the only way to increase the result is to work more hours or demand a higher rate, both of which have immovable ceilings imposed by time, health, taxes, aging, and real life, especially once inflation, rising healthcare costs, Medicare gaps, property taxes, HO fees, and the limitations of Social Security begin to compress financial flexibility later in life. And this is not a criticism of work, effort, or ambition. It is simply an observation about how linear systems behave over long periods of time, because linear income feels stable and respectable, but it is fragile by design. Since the moment labor stops, the income stops too, which is why the real financial shift does not come from asking how to make more money this year, but from reframing the problem entirely toward building assets that continue producing value independently of daily effort. And this reframing changes everything because it moves the goal from short-term cash flow to long-term compounding systems that grow quietly in the background while life continues. And this does not require quitting a job, glorifying hustle culture, or pretending entrepreneurship is a magic solution, because most businesses fail and many business owners are simply self-employed workers who have escaped a boss but not the time for money trap, often with more stress and fewer boundaries. So the real distinction is not employee versus entrepreneur, but time renter versus asset owner. And once that distinction is understood, the mathematics become unavoidable, because linear growth adds and compounding growth multiplies, and given enough time, multiplication always dominates addition, not as an opinion or motivational slogan, but as arithmetic that does not care about feelings, intentions, or effort. And this is where many people misunderstand wealth building, because they focus on activity rather than structure, income rather than systems, and effort rather than leverage, even though leverage is what allows a single action to produce results repeatedly over time, which is the defining characteristic of compounding assets. And this concept already exists inside everyday American financial tools that are often treated as boring or secondary, such as employer-sponsored 401k plans with matching contributions, Roth IRAs that allow tax-free qualified withdrawals, taxable brokerage accounts invested in diversified low-cost index funds, or real estate that generates net cash flow while benefiting from long-term appreciation, all of which function as mechanisms that decouple income from hours worked when used consistently and left uninterrupted. And the interruption part is where most people fail, because they understand compounding intellectually, but sabotage it behaviorally by pulling money out early, chasing excitement, consuming returns, or abandoning strategies before time has done its work, which prevents the exponential curve from ever forming. And a simple numerical illustration makes this clear. Without exaggeration, a single $10,000 investment earning a modest long-term average return of 7% annually, not guaranteed and not promised, grows to roughly $76,000 over 30 years through compounding alone. But if that same investment is interrupted repeatedly, cashed out, or redirected every few years, the mathematical engine never has the chance to accelerate. And this is why patience matters more than brilliance and consistency matters more than intensity. And the same principle applies to income structures. Because someone earning $100,000 per year who saves and reinvests consistently through tax-advantaged accounts and diversified investments over decades often builds more lasting wealth than someone earning twice as much but consuming nearly everything they make. Since wealth is not determined by how much money passes through your hands, but by how much you allow to compound over time. And this brings psychology into the conversation, because human behavior is the primary obstacle to compounding, not lack of opportunity, since the brain is wired to favor immediate rewards, social validation, and short feedback loops, which makes trading time for money feel satisfying and safe because the cause and effect are immediate, while building compounding assets feels uncomfortable and uncertain because the rewards are delayed, invisible, and boring. And boredom is precisely why compounding works, because if it were exciting, competitive, and emotionally stimulating, the returns would be arbitraged away by constant activity, and this psychological discomfort intensifies during the early years when progress feels slow, peers appear to be advancing faster, and visible rewards are minimal, which is why so many people abandon compounding systems right before they begin to matter, resetting the clock to zero and repeating the cycle indefinitely, and this behavior is reinforced by social norms that reward visible income, job titles, and lifestyle upgrades while quietly discouraging delayed gratification and reinvestment, even though the latter is what produces real financial independence over time. And this is especially relevant in the U.S. context, where retirement security increasingly depends on individual responsibility rather than guaranteed pensions, where Social Security replaces only a portion of pre-retirement income, where Medicare does not eliminate healthcare costs entirely, and where inflation steadily erodes purchasing power, making reliance on a single earned income stream increasingly risky. So the rational approach is not reckless risk-taking, but structured patience, starting small, staying within a circle of competence, protecting downside risk, and allowing compounding systems to run uninterrupted for long periods. And this approach applies not only to financial assets, but also to skill-based systems that can scale without proportional time input, such as intellectual property, automated services, or businesses with durable processes that function without constant oversight, because the defining test of a true asset is not whether it produces income today, but whether it can continue producing income without consuming additional hours tomorrow. And many people mistake ownership for freedom without realizing that owning a time-intensive operation is simply employment with different branding, whereas real assets retain functionality even when attention is removed. And this distinction becomes clearer over long time horizons, where small structural advantages widen into enormous gaps, because compounding works slowly at first and then all at once, which is why the first 5 years often feel unrewarding, the next 5 years feel mildly encouraging, and the following decades feel disproportionate compared to the effort invested. And this delayed payoff is the price paid for eventual leverage, which is why discipline and restraint are more valuable than ambition alone, since every dollar reinvested rather than consumed is a dollar that can multiply, and every hour invested into building systems rather than merely maintaining income is an hour that can repay itself repeatedly. And the real reward of compounding is not just financial abundance but control over time, because once assets begin covering expenses even partially, life decisions change, work becomes optional rather than compulsory, priorities shift from urgency to meaning, and attention can be allocated intentionally rather than reactively, which is the true dividend of financial independence. And this reality explains why individuals who start investing early, even with modest amounts, often achieve better outcomes than those who delay action despite higher incomes, because time is the only input to compound interest that cannot be replaced, borrowed, or accelerated, and every year of delay permanently removes a layer of exponential growth that can never be recovered, making inaction far more expensive than most early mistakes. And this leads to a simple but powerful mental model that governs all financial decisions. Actions either compound or consume. Contributions to retirement accounts compound. Diversified investments compound. Reinvested cash flow compounds, while high-interest debt, lifestyle inflation, and constant withdrawal consume, and trading time exclusively for money consumes the one resource that cannot be replenished, while building systems that work independently compounds effort across time. And once this model is internalized, behavior aligns naturally because decisions are filtered through long-term consequences rather than short-term comfort. And this is where consistency becomes the decisive advantage, because steady contributions to a 401k, disciplined funding of a Roth IRA, ongoing investment in diversified index funds, and patient reinvestment of returns create outcomes that appear extraordinary only to those who underestimate time. And it is important to state clearly and responsibly that none of this is a promise of guaranteed returns, because investing always involves risk. Market volatility is unavoidable, losses are possible, and tax outcomes vary by individual circumstances, which is why this discussion is educational in nature and not personalized financial advice. But the underlying principle remains universal and historically consistent. Compounding rewards patience and punishes interruption, and the choice facing every individual is not dramatic but decisive. Whether to continue allocating nearly all effort toward income that ends when work stops, or to redirect a portion of time and earnings toward assets that can function independently. And this choice compounds just like money does, because small decisions repeated consistently shape long-term outcomes, and each year spent delaying action removes not only that year's progress, but all the future growth that would have built upon it, making time itself the most valuable input in wealth creation. And the discipline required to build compounding systems is not glamorous, because it often involves saying no to immediate upgrades, resisting social pressure, and tolerating periods where progress feels invisible. But the alternative is far worse, since renting time indefinitely leads to dependency, fragility, and limited optionality later in life, especially as earning capacity declines. And this is why the individuals who ultimately achieve lasting financial freedom are rarely those who optimize for maximum short-term income, but those who accepted modest trade-offs early in exchange for durable systems that matured over decades, allowing compounding to do what it has always done quietly and relentlessly. And the irony is that the total hours worked across a lifetime may not differ dramatically between those who build assets and those who do not, yet the results diverge massively because one group builds structures that multiply effort, while the other consumes effort linearly, and this difference explains nearly every persistent wealth gap observed across long-time horizons. And the most costly mistake is not starting small, choosing imperfect investments, or experiencing temporary setbacks, all of which are recoverable, but interrupting compounding once it begins, because restarting the clock repeatedly destroys the exponential effect that makes patience worthwhile. And this is why disciplined, boring, long-term strategies outperform exciting, reactive ones, because the power lies not in activity but in duration, and once this reality is accepted, the path forward becomes straightforward even if it is not easy, involving consistent saving, diversified investing, controlled consumption, and a long-term perspective that prioritizes systems over events. And this framework applies regardless of income level, background, or starting point, because compounding does not require brilliance, only time, consistency, and restraint, and the earlier it begins, the more forgiving it becomes, while the longer it is delayed, the more demanding it grows. And this is the fundamental trade-off underlying every financial decision, whether to consume today or compound for tomorrow, whether to prioritize comfort now or optionality later, and whether to allow time to work as an ally or an adversary. And once this framework is understood deeply, financial behavior shifts from reactive to intentional, making long-term stability not a matter of luck, but of structure, patience, and disciplined execution over time, which is why building compounding assets is not a shortcut to wealth, but the only path that has reliably worked across generations, economic cycles, and changing technologies, provided the process is respected, protected, and allowed to run uninterrupted.